challenges. So just a brief bit of information about myself. So I'm an occupational therapist who studied in South Africa in 2015. I've previously worked in rural hospitals as well as rural special needs schools. I have been working in the London Borough of Sutton since May 2019 in a variety of different schools. And I'm passionate about pediatrics and how we can help pediatrics in terms of well-being and their families. So please enjoy. Just a little recap from our session the previous time on the importance of sleep. So let's all remember that research says that sleep is vital to function and to perform our activities of daily living. It's needed to stay healthy, interact, think, and perform to our best. Restful and adequate sleep provides the baseline for optimal occupational performance, participation, and engagement in daily life, a concept that is consistent with what us as OTs practice. This is something we can all relate to. A good night's sleep means we can ultimately perform the tasks we enjoy. The impact of sleep on function and participation is incorporated into the many lists of performance areas that OT practitioners address across one's lifespan. Sleep is ultimately a prerequisite to engagement in all activities. This is how and to what extent you are able to perform and participate in daily tasks that are meaningful to you. Think of all the things that occupy your time, such as getting up, getting ready for the day, feeding your cats, making coffee, scheduling appointments, going to work, developing and maintaining healthy relationships, playing sport, and anything else you would do from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep. Sleep deprivation doesn't just affect the child and the adult that is not sleeping. It also affects their caregivers, siblings, family, teachers, caregivers' job performance, and even the caregiver's ability to think and safety when driving to work. So a recap from the previous slide, the previous webinar, what is an enclosed safety bed? So this is a low stimulation, calming environment, removing the risk of harm. It reduces incidence of physical intervention and used by adults and children. There are sensory benefits that induce sleep, and they are prescribed for elopement issues, but also for your client that faces challenges daily with memory, sensory needs, and complex medical needs, as well as learning difficulties and epilepsy. Children and adults who could benefit from this bed may have autism, Alzheimer's, dementia, seizures, cerebral palsy, Angelman syndrome, brain injuries, as well as strokes or learning disabilities and sensory processing disabilities. So why a safety bed? Specialized safety beds can make a huge difference when the person has safety issues, poor sleep patterns, or behavioral difficulties. It can provide a safe sleep space, sleeping space, or calm area. This will also have a positive impact on the whole family. A separate space to be able to express feelings, especially when upset or agitated, can often be denied to those who need high levels of supervision. The personal space can support the development of independent self-regulation. So if we have a look on the screen, we talk about safety. So this could prevent nighttime wandering. It could eliminate entrapment during seizures. It can remove the risk of injury from falling out of bed. It can protect against elopement, non-restrictive enclosure, and protects from self-harming behaviors. As well as this, it encourages concentration and comfort and reducing distractions in the enclosed area, reducing noise, and a calm space to regulate and reduce anxiety. Also, entertainment is a very important factor. It's a place to play safely and also a place to encourage movement. Think about a child who may have cerebral palsy, who spends most of his day in his wheelchair, whether this be at school, at work, or even playing in a sporting activity. So a safety bed will allow them space to be able to move around and stretch, which is so important with children and adults like this. This is also important as parents and caregivers will have a good night's sleep, knowing their children or the adults they care for are safely in bed. So why should we consider safety beds earlier? Sleep and rest are documented as core occupations. To support healthy, active engagement in other occupations, sleep is one of the primary activities of the brain during early development and plays an important role in healthy cognitive and psychosocial development. As well as good sleep, this will also contribute to the adult and child emotional and behavioral regulation and family function. As you can see, all the boxes on the side, they indicate the different factors that are affected by sleep. So your cognitive ability. Did you forget to turn off your hair straightener before leaving the house? Did you accidentally run a red light? Did you maybe fall asleep during work? This all shows how sleep deprivation can reduce productivity, energy levels, as well as problem solving. As well as physical impact, a good night's sleep will increase the ability that you'll be able to learn new motor skills. Sensory impact, sleep deprivation may lead to impaired sensory perceptions and reduced responses to auditory stimuli. Psychological impact, more than half of insomnia cases or cases of people not sleeping are related to depression, anxiety, or psychosocial stress. Okay. So in our previous webinar, we had discussed these 4 aspects that are stopping us from prescribing safety beds earlier. Today, we will be looking at more intensely, not enough knowledge, specifically not enough knowledge on safety beds and legislation guidance, as well as perceptions on restraint. So during my research on this topic, I have narrowed down how we can combat these perceptions into the below topics. I will be talking about these topics as best I can based on the research I have found and relate this to safety beds. These are the 6 topics we will be discussing. At the bottom of the next couple of screens, it will indicate at the bottom which sector of these 6 we are on by highlighting that box. So we will first be talking about an individual risk assessment. So Risk Assessment and the Mental Capacity Act. This defines restraint as you restraining someone who may lack capacity to consent if you use force or the threat of force to make them do something they are resisting, or restrict their freedom of movement, whether they are resisting or not. For this to be lawful, it must be in that person's best interest and also necessary to prevent harm to the person and a proportional response to the likelihood and seriousness of this harm. So with that being said, what makes a good assessment? To encourage positive, proportionate risk enablement. Some risks are highly foreseeable and would lead to real harm. You must, of course, identify these risks and find ways to protect the person against them. The Mental Capacity Act is clear that you are protected from liability if your response is both necessary and proportionate, as described above. But we must balance safety against happiness. The search for extreme safety can lead to extreme distress and misery. However, in terms of safety beds, if the right safety bed is purchased for the individual, that can lead to no safety issues and a happy individual in the best environment. Enclosed safety beds provide sensory calming and anxiety reducing environments where clients have wanted their beds to be zipped up to prepare for sleep. This will be further discussed later in the testimonials. And as well, we need to also remember to continue our risk assessment review. Okay. Then, in order to conduct the best risk assessment, we need to consider 5 key steps. So first of all, recognizing the hazard or potential risk, then assessing the degree and the nature of this risk. How is it triggered? Then develop of a risk management plan, which is done with collaboration of the family and the client, as well as recording the assessment and the management plan and implementation of possible adaptations. And lastly, to review the assessment and the management plan regularly. So next couple of slides, we will be breaking down these parts of the risk assessment. So first of all, we would need to look at a method of identifying the hazard or the risk in any activity or situation. So we could first look at how is the risk triggered. So this may be a highly anxious child who is sensory seeking and likes to headbang as a way of self-soothing. This child may present with high sensory needs and difficulty in modulation. Factors that make the risk more likely to occur. So headbanging is the way the child self-soothes, usually before bed, so it's not always in a response to a changed routine, which indicates that this is happening frequently. This may be worsened if there is a change in the child's routine. Maybe there was an outing at school, which caused some anxiety or distress. Lastly, who may be affected by the risks and how? So clearly the child will be affected due to sleep deprivation, as well as a possible injury from head banging, as well as the family, who will also be sleep deprived and anxious over the child's safety at night. Overall, this will affect the family and the child's occupational performance. The next slide suggests that risk assessment involves asking a series of questions that fall under the headings of identify, analyze, and control. This may be shown in the grid below. So just quickly looking at it, they've identified it as what is the problem that could go wrong. We could analyze it by asking how often this is likely to occur, and controlling how would we eliminate this. The second part of the risk assessment, once we've identified the possible hazard or risk, is the management. So there are numerous tools for risk assessment, especially in areas such as falls prevention and manual handling. These tools can be useful to highlight or indicate possible hazards and for planning preventative action. However, information gathered from multiple sources needs to be put alongside clinical or professional judgment to give a comprehensive analysis of the potential risk. Where the situation involves clients, they and all those involved with their care need to be consulted. You need to be aware of any local policies or protocols that may exist for your organization. You will need to consider risk in each person's individual context. Remember that risk is dynamic and is always changing. A child who was previously getting up in the night and playing in their room has now been placed at increased risk, as they are now opening the door of their room and locking the back door and walking outside the house, indicating that risk is always changing and needs to be constantly reviewed. Lastly is our continued review. So regarding the duty of care, the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct states that your duty of care would not necessarily stop at the point when a person is discharged from your service. There should be a way of ensuring that a review of equipment or follow-up visit or phone call is in place to check the suitability and functioning of the safety bed. This is really important to also check the bed is being used for its proper purpose, as well as if the bed is not being used anymore, it could possibly be used as a recycle bed to a client that is in need. Reviewing is also really important when thinking about transitioning from child to adult services. So getting paperwork and the application ready to apply to the Court of Protection before the age of 16 is really important. This would include a robust risk assessment, assessment of capacity, a possible sleep diary, evidence of risk with the bed and without, the person's circumstances and who will be living with the person, the care plan, best interest assessment, and transition plan. This is so important for a smooth transition and to retain the safety bed, so as not to cause a disruption of having the safety bed removed for a period of time. This could be detrimental to the household and therefore is so important to provide review and follow-up. As well as risk assessment, our next point we've moved on to at the bottom is our collaborative approach. All team members are present in a shared decision-making process. So this plan formulated includes the client or the family where appropriate, and everyone in the team has a role and a voice where professionals, families, and clients can engage in conversation together. This will also help people have an improved understanding of the therapist's role and more clearly see the value of therapy. It was defined that collaborative services are an interactive process that focus teams on enhancing functional performance, education achievement, and participation of clients. This is so important in determining the plan and intervention for our clients and understanding that not one plan can fit all. Then moving on to our best practice checklist. So a multidisciplinary team comprising of family members and healthcare professionals need to work together in a collaborative approach, as was previously discussed. Avoidance of blanket solutions. One solution for one client doesn't necessarily mean it will fit all. Consideration for the well-being of the person, individual family members, and carers. This will be spoken about in a little bit more detail in our next slide. Then a detailed assessment, which is regularly reviewed in a structured way, including our risk assessment as previously spoken about. A clear intention to use the least restrictive practice to keep the person safe that is proportionate to the situation. And where relevant, to plan a smooth transition from children's services to adult services, considering the cooperation with other authorities as well as early intervention. This was actually really interesting, this piece of information I found. And it said that in the longer term, a failure to effectively intervene to address the complex needs of an individual in early childhood can result in a significant increase of public cost. For example, a 10% reduction in the total cost to the public sector of an individual's severe pathway could result in a potential saving of approximately £94,000 per individual. This was found under Scottish legislation. Early intervention of services is one of the cornerstones of the Getting It Right for Every Child approach. In England, the improvement of productivity and getting it right early will deliver savings of reducing complications and litigation to the value of £400 million. This information was recorded in 2018. Our next slide will go back to point 3, which is considering the well-being of the person. So ultimately, the question needs to be asked, is the person's life in danger or at risk? Are there sleep challenges resulting in unlocking doors and wandering outside their house, playing or touching with objects that may cause danger, high levels of sleep deprivation, or eating inedible objects? If a family has got in touch about cases such as these, where the child is in imminent danger, it is our duty of care and legal obligation to support need as therapists require immediate action. What would happen if the parents took no action and something detrimental had to happen to the client? Social services would launch safeguarding cases for negligence and inactivity. Therefore, a plan needs to be determined with the OT, family, counsel, and client to calm the situation, where either a temporary bed is obtained while waiting for maybe a bed of their own. Deprived of feeling safe and secure at night goes against human rights. So what if the person's life is not in immediate or direct danger? Do we have time to play with? What other factors do we need to consider? Remember the well-being of the family and the ultimate global impact. Families not sleeping as they are worried about an adult or a child will affect their ability to function and perform everyday tasks, as previously spoken about. This will affect their ability to perform effectively in their workplace, their judgment and ability to drive to their work, essentially driving drunk out of exhaustion, as well as their ability to look after themselves, as well as challenging family members. The next part of our restraint perceptions, we will be looking at legislation. We will mainly be looking at the legislation applicable in England and Wales. Other laws may have slight discrepancies, but the outcomes of what we achieve is more or less the same to ensure the families, so ensure that you are up to date and familiar with your own area's laws. So we will first be looking at the CARE Act. The general duty of the CARE Act is to promote well-being, strengthening the rights of people with learning disabilities, autism, and their family carers. It promotes fairer, more personalized care and shifts the focus of local authorities from providing services for specific groups to supporting individuals to achieve the outcomes that matter to them. The CARE Act gives local authorities a responsibility to assess the level of support that a carer may need. Promoting well-being includes the physical and mental health, participation in work and education, domestic, family, and personal relationships, as well as the individual's contribution to society. The CARE Act gives carers the right to receive support from their local authority if they have eligible needs. The person who is cared for needs cannot be imbalanced to the person caring for them. We can pick out all these points and see how sleep is needed to perform them. It notes that the individual is best placed to judge their own occupational needs and well-being. We can recommend intervention and resources to promote sleep, as this promotes mental health, education, work, and behavior. Local authorities will cover the below issues, including equipment needs and needs for respite. According to the CARE Act, there is an emphasis on early intervention. Local authorities have a legal duty to prevent, reduce, and delay people's conditions from worsening and landing up ultimately in a crisis situation. Care assessment should include a plan of action which shows what services are going to be provided. Under the CARE Act, local authorities make sure that people who live in their areas receive services that prevent their care needs from becoming more serious, can get the information they require, and have a range of provision of high quality appropriate services to choose from. What is this assessment process? So this assessment must be carried out by an appropriately trained assessor. For instance, an OT who will consider a number of factors, such as the person's needs and how they impact on their well-being. For instance, a need for help when getting dressed or support to go to work. The aim is to get a full picture of the person and what needs and goals they may have. After carrying out the assessments, the local authority will then consider whether any of these needs identified are eligible for support. The Human Rights Act says that people have the right to rest and to leisure. Sleeping and resting are part of restorative activities. People have the right to participate in enabling them to fulfill their potential and experience satisfaction. Secondly, people have the right to be supported to participate in sleep occupations. Sleep is necessary for purposeful activity. Everyone has the right to liberty and security of person. No one shall be deprived of his or her liberty in accordance with the procedure, unless in accordance with the procedure prescribed by law. This is said in the Human Rights Act. Participation in sleep may be difficult for some, as they are under great risk of harm and therefore require intervention. They have a right to be feeling secure and therefore may need to be deprived of their liberty. Carrying on to DOLS and our Mental Capacity Act, allowing restraint and restriction to be imposed if in the person's best interest. Deprivation of liberty became law in 2009. Having mental capacity means being able to understand and to retain information and to make a decision based on that information. Someone might not have the capacity because they may have a learning disability, dementia, a mental health problem, or a stroke or brain injury. The law aims to ensure that people who lack capacity to make decisions by themselves get the support they need to be as involved as possible in decisions about their lives. In summary, this ensures that the arrangements are in the person's best interest, that they need someone appointed to represent them, and the person is given a legal right of appeal over the arrangements. The deprivation of liberty principles, which are applicable in England and Wales, are presented as follows. So every adult has the right to make his or her own decision and must be assumed to have capacity to do so unless proven otherwise. Individuals being supported to make their own decisions are really important, and people also have the right to make what others might regard as an unwise decision. If a person has been assessed as lacking capacity, then an action must be taken to be made in his or her best interest. And a less restrictive option, someone making a decision or acting on behalf of a person who lacks capacity must consider whether it is possible to decide or act in a way that would interfere less with the person's rights and freedom of action. There will be key changes from DOLS to LPS, which is the Liberty Protection Safeguard. This is supposed to occur in April 2022. The Liberty Protection Safeguards will replace the current deprivation of liberty safeguards, which have been widely criticized for being administratively cumbersome, resulting in delays to the authorization process. The bill seeks to slim the authorization process to ensure compliance with the law and to put the cared for person at the heart of the decision-making process. This includes those with dementia, autism, learning disabilities, who may lack the relevant capacity. An authorization can't be granted unless a range of people have been consulted, including the cared for person. The purpose of this consultation is to identify their wishes and feelings. Main points on what will change from deprivation of liberty to the Liberty Protection Safeguards would be 3 assessments will form the basis of this: a capacity assessment, a medical assessment, and a necessary and proportionate assessment to determine if the arrangements are necessary to prevent harm to that person. Greater involvement for families, targeted approach, as well as extending the scheme to 16 and 17-year-olds. Currently, when a 16 and 17-year-old need to be deprived of their liberty, an application must be made to the Court of Protection under the Liberty Protection Safeguards. Responsible bodies can authorize the arrangements without a court order. This will deliver more proportionate decision-making about deprivation of liberty and minimize potential distress and intrusion for young people and their families. Extending the scheme to domestic settings. The Liberty Protection Safeguard will apply to individuals residing in domestic settings. This change ensures that all individuals who need to be deprived of their liberty will be protected under the Liberty Protection Safeguards, regardless of where they reside, without needing to go to court. The Children's Act, a child in need is defined as one who is unlikely to achieve or maintain an acceptable level of health or development, or their health and development will be significantly impaired without the provision of services. A key principle is reflected in the local authority's function to provide services which support children and their families. The welfare of the child is looked at in terms of the child's developmental needs. And quality of sleep plays a crucial role in the development of emotional, physical, and mental well-being. This reflects the OT's philosophy of a client-centered holistic approach to therapy. According to the Children's Act, local authorities have a duty to promote the welfare of children who are in need by providing a range of services appropriate to those children. Local authorities are effectively under a duty to carry out an assessment of a child's needs as part of the duty to take reasonable steps to identify the extent to which there are children in need within their area. This assessment should investigate needs in a holistic manner. Importantly, once an authority has decided that it is necessary to meet a need, it cannot avoid doing so because it does not have the necessary resources or preferred method of meeting this need. And lastly, Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act lists the services to both disabled children and adults. The duty is to provide any of the following that are necessary to meet the needs of a disabled person. Namely, any extra facilities designed to make the home safer, more comfortable, or easier to live in, as well as help going on holiday, whether this is provided under arrangements made by the local authority or otherwise. Some safety beds, such as the Eurozone, can be used for travel to allow families to go on holiday without the stress of safe sleeping. Moving on from our legislation, we will now be looking at freedom versus safety. I think this is a really important point and one that is probably the most important after everything that's been spoken about already. But what is the point of human rights to freedom, giving someone the freedom and they are a danger to themselves or others? So important that we need to weigh up what will happen if we do something and intervene versus what will happen if we do nothing. If alternative solutions to safe sleeping is not looked at, we are ultimately depriving that person of safety. Our clients have the freedom to choose what they want to sleep in and what makes them feel safe. Lastly, of the 6 points that we've looked at to combat challenges of restraint would be models. So one of the most common models that we use as OTs is the person, occupation, and environment model, which can be used to help consider all the various issues involved. A fundamental consideration is the environment and how this impacts upon a person's occupational performance. An important factor to consider in relation to the above is the person's occupation. So this is activities performed in the safety bed. This could be sleeping, eating, reading, watching something off an iPad or the TV. And occupational therapists must then consider how the environment can be adapted to safely support these occupations. If the child or adult is experiencing seizures or nighttime wandering or is engaging in dangerous activities in the house, then the current environment is not suitable to perform activities and may need to be adapted to involve a safety bed and how the safety bed will support and enable activities that will be carried out in the bed. Okay, so those 6 topics should hopefully provide an overview of how we can look at restraint and safety beds a bit differently. And it's so important that we cover things such as a risk assessment, such as completing this assessment with the family and other relative people who are involved, as well as knowing the legislation and policies in our area, and ultimately looking at, is the child or the client's life in danger? And basing this on our occupational models. We will now be moving on to some research about the enclosed safety beds. A lot of this research, unfortunately, is American, but I still think it is quite relevant to the topic that we are talking about. So according to this research done in 2014, they had said that a mesh or safety bed is not considered a restraint when the client meets the following criteria: is developmentally delayed, there is a documented safety concern, and is developmentally appropriate for use. This was really interesting. The next couple of slides have spoken about testimonials of beds that have been recommended and used in this area, and a couple of interesting pieces of information of what family members had said about these beds. I'll be highlighting a couple of the important parts. Louise had mentioned in her testimonial that her child who has Down syndrome and ADHD, would not sleep at all. He would destroy his room by climbing, by banging the doors, by shouting, which also affected his behavior in the day and ultimately his ability to engage in school-related tasks. With his safety bed, namely the Eurozone, he now goes to bed and sleeps throughout the night, and there's a huge improvement in his behavior. Sophie has said she has had her safety bed for a few months and it's been great. It's really helped her to cope over Christmas with changes in her routine and her own safe space to relax in that she can take herself to when she's feeling stressed. Laura had said that her son had recently gone through many tent beds and is very destructive and had destroyed most of those beds. Since the Eurozone, he loves going to bed and sleeps so much better as he feels secure and he feels comfortable. He loves playing in it in the daytime. And he also requests this to be zipped up and covered at night before he goes to sleep, as he feels safe. Rebecca has said, it's a reassurance that your child is going to be okay when you wake up. It's a good night's sleep for the whole family. So many parents put their child to bed at night without worrying about if their child will come to harm. I can now be one of those parents. Another testimonial by Teresa had said, she needed to have a bed to travel at very short notice, and they were quite nervous about using a travel bed. Now she says she is so excited as her son has responded really well to this bed, thinking that it's actually a pirate ship. She said that they had zipped him up and didn't hear anything from him again until the morning. She had said that they hadn't been able to break away from home for a holiday for over 2 years, as they couldn't keep their son safe. They have now found that their safety bed, namely the Eurozone, has been an absolute blessing. As she had said previously, her son was kicking doors and waking up the whole family, and the noise was really unbearable. Now he feels really safe in his safety bed and secure. He also enjoys the LED lights and other different colors and settings that are in his special bed. Lynn had said that her child previously only needed 1 to 2 hours of sleep at night, at most since she was born. And after getting this bed a couple of weeks ago, it has completely changed everything. She now loves it, gets in it each night, and then waits for her mum to zip her up. She gets up in the morning for school with no problem. She isn't falling asleep in class anymore and is now reaching her full potential. Mum also isn't constantly yawning at work, and she's loving having a proper night's sleep, knowing that her child is safe. These are just wonderful testimonies of how these beds don't just provide a good night's sleep for the child or the client affected, but ultimately for the whole family and how their occupations during the day are affected. This is another testimonial about, well, it was actually an article I'd found about the family talking about their positive experience using a safety bed during the family's father's fight against cancer. She had said, with cancer being spread to the brain, the result was her father being physically restrained as he was violently moving around too much. She said her father had been tied down and restrained like a wild animal in his time of desperate need, which was really sad. Upon seeing this enclosed bed, her family had mixed opinions of what it would be like, but soon realized that he was being kept safe from falling out and still had the freedom to move around inside this bed without actually being physically tied down. When it was time for her father to be sent to hospice in another location, they had specifically asked the advising staff about sites with enclosed beds because they had wanted their father to be able to pass away with as much dignity as possible. We were actively seeking facilities that had enclosed beds, she said, even over things like the number of patients in the room and other criteria. Another case, this was a really interesting case about a teenage girl living in the States, and it was the battle between her and her family as well as the state on the use of a safety bed. So what this case was about was this teenage girl had severe disabilities, including cerebral palsy, autism, developmental delays, scoliosis, and epilepsy. And the state's health officials saw it as restraint with her being in the safety bed. But to her parents, it was a safe place for their daughter to sleep, a guard against her wandering when caregivers were preoccupied, and also a safe space in case she had had an epileptic fit. Their battle with the state authorities over this bed that a doctor and team of therapists had prescribed dragged on for 2.5 years and burned through $100,000 in attorney fees, and challenged the notion of how much or how little restraint is allowed when caring for individuals with developmental disabilities. Her bed was designed to provide a safe environment for people with neurological disorders and was obtained through medical prescription. Her parents bought this bed in 2012, and her bed prevented elopement and provided a sensory conducive environment for her sleep. For 4 years, the respite caregivers provided by the state's Developmental Disability Division put her in the bed at the end of the day and pushed the lock so she wouldn't wonder if she woke. It also was a useful way to keep her safe if a caregiver needed to step away to use the bathroom or to clean a room. But this all changed in 2016 after 4 years. The family received a routine visit from the state's disability division. A week later, the Department of Child Safety showed up responding to a complaint about child neglect. The child's parents argued that the Developmental Disability Division had misinterpreted the rule of restraint and in the process have now denied the child and the family their rights. This dispute dragged on for 2 years. According to Dr. Malmed, a developmental behavioral pediatrician, said tactics such as encouraging the child to take deep breaths or other strategies to calm and relax are the first response when a child is acting out or upset. But sometimes a form of restraint or constraint is needed. Besides, restraints are used all the time. We use car seats, he said. We hold children's hands when we cross the street. These beds, with their locking doors and tall sides, prevent children from wandering at night. If they keep a child safe, this can be a lifesaver. The line between restraint and safety can be a difficult one to define. The state authorities concluded that the locked bed was not needed to keep her safe. They suggested caregivers could let her sit in the safety bed propped up by pillows. If the caregiver had to use the bathroom, they were advised to take the girl and sit her on the floor with them. This completely shocked parents. Mum and dad fought back in the battle and recommended. The DDD had also recommended her specialized seat and her wheelchair, offering these as alternatives to confining her in the bed. To the family, this was also completely absurd. If the locked bed is a restraint, then so is a wheelchair or a specialty chair, because she is strapped in them to prevent her from falling out. She currently spends most of her day, in her wheelchair with a 3-point restraint, where she goes to a local public school. The oversized bed, in fact, gives her more freedom of movement than any of her chairs, the couple noted. But because she can stand up and walk around, keeping it unlocked risks falls. And those falls happened more than once. She fell and hit her head on the back of a drawer, as well as falling backwards and having a seizure when a caregiver's head was turned away. This gave the family a partial victory. Her individual service plan was changed to include use of the bed for safe sleeping and for play. Her father had said we had won the battle, but the law goes on, and at what expense? Of savings accounts being completely drained, as well as disruption and overall anxiety in the family. What about this case? Could this be another case of us getting it wrong? In response to a previous case study, a mother had come forward with her story. As the parents of an autistic child, CM took control measures that to an outsider could appear overly harsh, such as putting a lock on her young son's door after he had slipped out at night and was found unclothed playing in the river. We want to be the least restrictive in what we do, but we also want to keep them alive, she said, of the dilemma parents face dealing with children with special needs. Families come up with solutions because they have to. It's easy to be judgmental when you don't have to be there 24/7, and you as the parent need to actually use the bathroom. Interestingly enough, with this case, the mum had continued to talk about how a safety bed was actually decided for the child as the safest option in his room, as even though she had previously locked the door, he was still engaging in unsafe behaviors, such as jumping off different furniture in the room. Ultimately, the collaborative approach and a risk assessment was used together to determine that a safety bed was actually the best option for this child. Are these cases of us getting it wrong? Interesting enough that sleep deprivation in America resulted in 1,550 fatalities and 40,000 non-fatal injuries per year, which is really, really scary. Another case of us getting it wrong was a child had sustained a traumatic brain injury from headbanging because despite frequent requests, nothing was done. After the injury occurred, a safety bed was purchased for the family. But one more headbang could potentially be fatal. How did we get to this point where this could probably have been avoided? As well as looking at accounts of family members and parents who have found the great benefit of using safety beds, this next article was really interesting, as this is a nurse's account, so a professional account of her experience of enclosed beds and how this was assessed and determined to be the best possible solution. This took place in New York, so it's another American article, but just as relevant. So although it's considered a restraint because it limits the patient's ability to get out of bed, an enclosure bed is less restrictive than other types of restraints. It can be used as an alternative when a vest restraint would cause more agitation and is probably not appropriate. The medical center in the States became interested in this enclosure bed in 2007 as a way to decrease patient falls, protect against injury from seizures, and reduce patient sitter costs. We've seen the enclosure bed have a calming effect on patients and give them more freedom than wrist or ankle restraints. Before the hospital decided to add the enclosure bed to their inventory, staff nurses and others conducted an evaluation to identify patient risk behaviors, a risk assessment, and they conducted a 6-month trial of the enclosure bed, during which staff used the bed and completed an evaluation tool. The tool asked specific questions about staff comfort level with the bed, ease of use, the family's response, as well as mainly, did the bed actually meet the client's needs? Based on staff feedback and positive patient outcomes during the evaluation, the enclosed bed was added to the potential interventions to prevent falls and to provide a safer environment for patients. Once the decision to use an enclosed bed is made, the clinicians educated the family about the bed, its function, and the reason for using it, and how the bed contributes to a cocoon-like environment. The hospital quickly incorporated the safety beds into their safety plan for post-surgery patients. Also, interestingly enough, several patients have been discharged from the hospital with a plan of care that included an enclosed bed. In the home, the bed can be used for patients with agitation secondary to maybe dementia, or for pediatric patients with significant chronic neurological or sensory challenges. The experience of the family gained with the enclosure bed in the hospital helps provide a safe discharge plan for several patients and easier transition from hospital to home. This is really important to see how this was not just one person making this decision, but the collaborative team of the nurses, other staff members, the patient, as well as the family worked together to take into account the best need for the patient's well-being. How should these safety beds be used? Safety beds can be used as part of the behavior intervention. It should always be used as a planned intervention and accompanied by an individual risk assessment. Safety beds can be used as a sensory space when combined with maybe lighting or other sensory equipment. Care must be taken when using this equipment that all safety precautions have been observed and taken into account. For those with a short attention span or who are vulnerable to distraction, can provide a low stimulation environment in which one-to-one work can take place. This can also be used reactively to remove background noise, distraction, or anxiety, and can support the child to take themselves to the safety bed when they feel anxious or agitated. This reduces the need for hands-on physical restraint. This can also help to keep relationships intact, as well as being used for safe play. This is just a list of other restrictive practices that maybe we don't even realize that we're using every day, but these are baby gates and locking bedroom doors, bed rails, high chairs, or even limb restraints. These are still restrictive practices and are non-intrusive for sleep. We use restraints every day as a safety measure, so why is this any different? These restraints can be so important because let's think about what would happen if we don't use them and if they weren't put into place. In summary, taking this webinar into account and looking at all the different factors discussed, these are the most important steps I have found in determining whether a safety bed is in the best interest of our client. So we need to look at these points. Are the accommodations we provided in the best interest of our client? Have we taken into account an individual risk assessment suited for that client and not looking at blanket solutions? Have we looked at a person-centered approach which enhances the quality of life? Have we looked at the knowledge of current legislation, guidance, and policy framework and made ourselves familiar with the framework that is in our area? The constant need for review. This can be looked at as an emotive subject, but it actually doesn't need to be. If these things are carried out, the right solution can be found for the family in an appropriate way to assist the family as well as the clients that we are dealing with. Perfect.